Welcome, everyone. Hello to this exclusive GZERO Media live stream presentation of the highly anticipated annual Top Risk Report from our parent company, Eurasia Group. Just weeks from the second inauguration of Donald Trump, with the war still raging in Ukraine, crises still crushing the parts of the Middle East, and right now, breaking news, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, just announcing his resignation. So we're always on the news here. There's so much polarization throughout the world right now. What will the top risks be in 2025? How will they affect your business and how will they affect you? That is what we will reveal today. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm Evan Solomon. I'm the publisher of GZERO Media. And I'm joined today by the co-authors of the report, of course, the president and the founder of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media. Ian Bremmer is here. So is our Eurasia Group chairman, Kupchan. And we've got a remarkable group of experts as well. Susan Glasser is here from the New Yorker, Jon Lieber here from Eurasia Group. So we'll get to them as well. So let's get at this. How different will 2025 be from 2024? What will the top risks look like and how will they play out? Ian, before we get to the risks, let's just get a general overview, because the overarching theme this year is a kind of, you describe it as a kind of a yin yang, some progress, some hope, but you say we're in a geopolitical recession. Let's just get a macro view of the top risks. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that the world order is no longer aligned with the balance of power. So if you think about the most powerful countries in the world, they are overwhelmingly, first, the United States, second, China. The United States has for decades promoted a bunch of international institutions that were aligned with its values, promoting the idea of the U.S. leading as the global sheriff, or leading free trade architecture globally, or promoting democracy, common values, rule of law around the world. That is no longer something that the Americans have any interest in. It's not something the Chinese are aligned with. And other countries are far too weak to try to take that slack up. So instead, they're playing defense. So a geopolitical recession, the only way out of it is you have to either build new institutions that better reflect your balance of power, or you reform your existing institutions so they're more aligned with the people that have power, or you break things and you end up in conflicts and war. Well, all three are happening, but this year, overwhelmingly, it's the third that's getting most of the energy. So the U.S. is oriented towards breaking global commitments and architecture, pulling out of such agreements, getting itself unilateralism globally. And the rest of the world is trying to say, I hope they don't pay attention to me first. And by the way, Justin Trudeau, one could argue, is kind of the first international casualty of these top risks this year. He was the guy that couldn't get out of the spotlight. In fact, he decided to put himself more into it. When Trump beat him up, he goes and he flies down to Mar-a-Lago, right? And it goes very badly for him. Trump keeps calling him the 51st governor. And now he's no longer. I suspect there's going to be, we'll have a number of names we'll be able to add to that list over the course of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll dig into that because it plays into some of the risks that we'll reveal in a minute. Ian, Cliff, let me just talk to you because your overarching theme, I mean, look, what happened in Syria right at the end of the year, the sudden collapse, what's happened in the Middle East, the terrorist attack in New Orleans. I mean, the year ended badly in many ways. How would you right now describe the geopolitical landscape as we head into the new year?
I think we have a deepening and really rare absence of global leadership. More chaos than at any time since the 30s, and that was the run-up to World War II. I mean, look, the U.S. is in many ways still the leading power, unrivaled military might. Yet the Trump administration, with this unilateralist approach, is going to, cement U.S. abdication of leadership. And even if we get a multilateralist Democrat next time, succeeding Trump, like Biden, the U.S. will have a reputation of being a country that flip-flops every 4 years. It just won't have credibility anymore. I just want to point out just real quickly that we're witnessing something really rare in diplomatic history. A pretty much unique case of a country that established an international order then taking it down, abdicating its throne. I can't think of a previous case. And it's a dynamic that will be very prone to vacuums and misperceptions. And finally, final point is that in this context, we have a truly revisionist, angry major power, Russia. And there are going to be lots of fuses for Russia to light over coming years.
Cliff, you're tipping dangerously close to revealing one of our risks, but hang in there. But it's a great segue because let me get to them. We're going to count them down from 10 to 1. We're going to go through the first 5 real quick, and we'll have a kind of rapid fire round bouncing back between Ian and Cliff, and then we'll bring in Susan and John as we get into the top 5. So here we go. These are the Eurasia Group top risks of 2025. Number 10, Mexican standoff. Mexico's new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, very popular, but she has obviously facing huge flashpoints with the new Trump administration. This will test her political and diplomatic skills. Ian, a lot of folks might wonder, wait, of all the risks, Mexico? What's your rapid fire on why this is so important?
Yeah, number 10 barely made the list, but there are a lot of problems that the Trump administration has with Mexico right now. It's the trade deficit, it's goods coming through Mexico from China, it's fentanyl, it's illegal migration, bunch of issues. She's going to have a hard time navigating that. She wants to. She's very oriented towards cutting a deal with Trump, but she's a PhD environmental scientist from Berkeley. I can't think of a demographic that would have a harder time individually getting on with Trump. It's going to be harder than AMLO did with Trump in the first administration. And she also has to deal with overhang from AMLO because of the constitutional reforms, especially judicial reform, which has crushed the peso and Mexican markets over the last couple of months. So she really doesn't have much room to get things wrong. I think that over the next 4 years, Mexico-U.S. relations will end up in the right place, but it's going to start in a much more fractious way, and it's going to hurt the economy and the markets. That's why it makes number 10.
Yeah, and you said 2 things that we'll pick up on later. Getting on with Trump. Man, is that going to be a critical thing for leaders? And the southern border is clearly the most radioactive political issue, obviously in the U.S., or certainly one of them. Cliff, let's go to risk number 9 in the Eurasia Group top risks of 2025. Something called ungoverned spaces, conflict and humanitarian crises in places, obviously like Gaza, Sudan, Myanmar, Haiti. They're essentially becoming power vacuums emerge here. Obviously, for the populations, there's misery. As we go through a quick rapid fire, Cliff, why is this important?
Well, I think what's notable and different about this year is the number of ungoverned spaces in the Middle East. Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Libya. I mean, much of the non-Persian Gulf part of the Middle East is very thinly governed. More misery in Gaza. The West Bank becoming more like Gaza. Israeli tactics are getting very, very rough there, destroying homes. Lebanon will remain a failing state as a ceasefire, but the government is still very, very weak. Syria could become a power vacuum, and a very dangerous one for extremism, a place where ISIS can regenerate itself. But there are 3.5 million Ukrainians, not a large number, not a small number, that are going to be living in permanently annexed, whatever you want to call it, parts of Russia. They're going to fall off the radar of the West. So one other point here, Evan, is we have included space in thinly governed spaces, thinly governed space. But okay, in outer space, the 2 great powers, US and China, disagree on governance. On the moon. We're going to have a lot of satellites this year. The chance of a satellite collision or incident radiating back to Earth is pretty high. So that's the risk.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about failed states, ungoverned spaces, but space is there's some regulation. But as we talk about in the report, and folks can check that out when you read the full report, which we urge you to do, we'll dig into that. Again, I'm just going to try to bound through these top 5. Risk number 8 is AI unbound. No surprise, Ian, we talked a lot about AI, the relentless pace of technological development, the unbound adequate safeguards and governance issues. You held the pen for the United Nations High-Level Advisory Board on AI governance. So you've been at the very sharp end of the spear on this, but it's bloody tough. Why is this a top risk in 2025?
Yeah, AI this year, the UK has a summit coming up. It was the AI Safety Summit. They've rebranded it as the AI Action Summit. That tells you pretty much everything you need to know. The Europeans feel like they went too far in terms of regulation, and now they're being left behind. They need to focus on more investment, more entrepreneurship. The Americans going to rip up the old Biden executive order on AI that was early stage regulation written together with the systemically important AI companies. The US-China just beginning to have an AI dialogue. That'll probably be ended under the Trump administration. So too, they'll end the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. In other words, I'm a big advocate for AI. I think it's an incredible opportunity to unlock human capital around the world, as well as to drive innovation and invention for industrial use. But we're talking about risks right now. And this year, you are not going to have enough capacity to deal with growing risks from misuse of AI. You know, our organization, we were taking a look at Meta's Llama, which is their open source. Some of our folks downloaded it to see what was and wasn't possible when they give it their own instructions. And they found that they could use it to figure out how to kill someone with arsenic or how to assassinate CEOs of companies. Now, we're not doing that. But there are people out there that
we're not doing that.
No, but there are people out there that will use AI for those purposes. And so, I mean, the concern is that we're going to have to find out. It's going to be trial by action where the landmines are in AI explosion, in the use for individuals and for companies and governments, many of whom are not aligned with stability and prosperity for the world.
Yeah, in a sense, the AI Unbound, risk number 8, in some ways reflects a lot of these risks, which is the promise and opportunity and the peril that comes shotgun with that. Okay, let's go to top risk number 7 for 2025, beggar thy world. This risk focuses on the potential consequences of the US-China looking inward at their own economic concerns, while other nations are trying to emerge out of their own debt and their own tepid growth. This again will play out again. These are connected in a way to some of the risks coming up. Cliff, why did this make the list?
It made the list because global markets are riding very high right now, mostly on the back of the US. And we think they're in for a disappointment. The world's 2 largest economies are exporting disruption, which I find very interesting, to the rest of the world. China's exporting over capacity. The US under Trump will likely export higher than expected interest rates and a strong dollar. A lot of countries are going to be faced with a really tough choice between letting Chinese imports crush a valuable sector like EVs and raising protectionist barriers, which have their own real downfalls. And finally, a stronger dollar and higher rates are really going to tighten financial conditions. EMs will pay especially, but it's going to be a tough macroeconomic environment out there.
Yeah.
Let me stop there.
Well, we're going to get to that because this really ties into other risks. Yep. Finally, risk number 6, Ian, Iran on the ropes. And Iran suffered a series of setbacks. They have never been weaker in decades. Their geopolitical position has been dealt. Recent blows, obviously, the collapse of Syria, the collapse of their major proxy, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and Hamas. Why, though, are they on the top risks of 2025?
It's probably the top risk in the Middle East this year. The wars in Gaza and in Lebanon with Hezbollah should be coming to a close. But Iran is really in the worst geopolitical position that they have been in decades. They have, as you say, lost their axis of resistance, mostly at the hands of Israel. The U.S. certainly helped out. And Trump coming in is going to put much more pressure on Iran, more sanctions, more economic pressure at a time that their economy is already failing. And that it's unclear whether or not Trump would be willing to support Israel in going after their nuclear program. Israel can't do it by themselves. And certainly there are many in the Trump administration and many in Netanyahu's government that believe that this is a unique time to get Iran when they are weak, when they're at their weakest. And that means hit them hard and hope for regime change. Let the Iranian people then do the rest of the work. We don't think that they are about to fall, but it is moving in that direction. You know, as someone who used to study the Soviet Union back in the 80s and the 90s, the Soviets first lost the Eastern Bloc, and then they had no story to tell internally. Their economy was falling apart, and their people revolted. Well, you know, the Iranians are now, I would say they're roughly in the 1989 moment that the Soviets were in, where they've lost their empire in the region, and now the people are angry. And you even see insurrection and insurgency among ethnic minorities in places like Balochistan and Sistan. And you've got an 85-year-old supreme leader with serious health problems who hasn't figured out who his replacement is going to be. So definitely they are heading towards collapse. How much the Israelis and the Trump administration are prepared to push to help is an open question. We'll find out real soon.
Okay, we're going to bring in everyone, but Ian, just before I let that go, obviously there's concern that they could do a dash to an atomic bomb. They're close to buttress their weakness by doing that. That of course is a huge risk as well.
In the near term, the likelihood that they would do that, in my view, is very low. They've been very risk averse over the last year precisely because they understand they don't actually have an effective deterrent against Israel, which is, you know, over 1,000 miles away. They don't have an effective deterrent against the U.S. Escalation dominance is in the hands of their enemies, and they are 6 months away from weaponizing a nuke, probably a year from being able to stick it on a missile. And while if they're trying to make that dash to a weapon, they're going to get attacked. Yeah. So I think that that's an outcome that occurs only if things go in a very bad direction. But what we'll see in the first few months will be maximum pressure from Trump, espionage, and maybe some strikes from the Israelis that are lower level, and the Iranians sitting on their hands and trying to cut a deal. Our expectation is that that deal won't work, but there's a possibility that the Iranians will put everything on the table and Trump will deserve a Nobel Prize.
Well, this is getting to the next risk. So let me just quickly update as we go through the top 10 Eurasia Group top risks of 2025. Number 10, Mexican standoff. Number 9, ungoverned spaces, including spaces, Cliff pointed out. Number 8, AI unbound. Number 7, beggar thy world, and keep that in mind as we get to some of the top 5 risks. And number 6, as Ian just spoke about, Iran on the ropes. Let's bring in our Eurasia Group head of research and managing director for U.S. politics, because you can see where we're headed here. And also Susan Glasser, who is a staff writer for The New Yorker, a longtime friend of our show. You see her on GZERO World with Ian Bremmer, and great, Susan, to have you back. And she's covered everything from U.S. politics to Russia. And that brings us perfectly to top risk number 5, which is Russia still rogue. Even if a ceasefire is reached in Ukraine. Cliff, I'll quickly start with you and then I'll bring in Susan. You know, this was a risk last year. They're still rogue this year. What threat does Putin pose to the EU, or what is the top risk this year, Cliff?
Well, the risk is that Russia has become a structural rogue country. By far the world's leading power, now that Iran, as Ian just talked about, has lost its power projection capability. So Russia really stands out right now. You know, the war is going to get worse in the early part of this year, but, you know, Trump will come in, and I do think that Zelensky is going to want a ceasefire. He's losing the war. He's losing the war. He's got to stop it somehow. That Putin's going to be a tougher sell because he's winning the war. My Russian contacts are kind of very uncertain about what he's going to do. But I think they've got their own manpower and economic problems coming. And Putin is going to want to, you know, invest in this really, really strange relationship with Trump. But what we get this year is a ceasefire, but no peace agreement. The ceasefire is unstable, and you get continuing hostile relations between Russia and Europe, and a lot of asymmetric action against NATO countries in Europe from Moscow.
Cliff, thanks for that. Let me bring in Susan. Susan, first of all, happy New Year to you, and great to have you here. I think one of my colleagues at GZERO, Alex Clement, was pointing out that Putin is celebrating his 25th New Year's this year, like 25 years. You know, as I used to say in Afghanistan, you guys got the watches, we've got the time. This guy never seems to leave. What's the risk here?
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with everything that Cliff just said. We were in Moscow together in the early years of Putin's long tenure. We would not have predicted 25 years ago that Putin would be the longest serving leader of Russia since Stalin in the Soviet times. And by the way, he's still young enough to surpass Stalin's actual record. And I think if you look back over those 2 decades, what have we systematically done is sort of underestimate Putin, both his staying power and his willingness to take maximally disruptive and violent steps. And then also, I would say, in addition to consistently underestimating Putin, we've consistently failed to take him to listen to what he's saying, not because he's not, often a liar and a conspiracy theorist, but because he has also signaled in quite clear ways that we simply have refused to process because they're at odds with our own worldview. So Putin has said since the beginning, really, of this invasion that it is a war, first of all, against a country whose legitimacy he does not accept. He does not believe that Ukraine is a legitimate country. He is at war in an existential sense with Ukraine, but he has also framed it very explicitly to his own public as a war between Russia and the United States and the West. And given all that, Cliff is absolutely right to say it's not the likelihood of some long-term peace deal, treaty signed in Paris that lasts for the ages, highly, highly unlikely. But more than that, I think, it suggests not only a rogue power, but one that's willing to take measures again and again and again that we refuse to believe he's going to take until he actually does them.
Yeah, and just quickly weigh in. I mean, Putin's had this, one of his talents as a leader has been playing a weekend into a strong hand. I mean, this guy oscillates between things going real bad and then he seems to emerge stronger. But talk about the risk this year if prices of oil fall. Like, what does a rogue Russia, how does he play this hand this year, and how does it play out in a risk in your view?
He needs to end the war too, at least suspend it, because I mean he's having a hard time raising and throwing fighters into the wood chipper. He's having a hard time at home economically. It would be good for Putin to have 6 months, a year to rest and rebuild. He still intends to take more territory, to remove Zelensky from power and the rest. Though that's not going to change. But I think the problem we have here, I mean, first of all, we don't yet have a ceasefire. I know that Trump said he was going to do it in a day. He sometimes exaggerates. It is going to take longer than a day. In the run-up between now and when we have a ceasefire, there's going to be escalation. There will be more assassinations, more long-range missile targeting, more critical infrastructure hit. So that risk environment goes up for the next few weeks and months. But even once you get a ceasefire, if the Russians are still under maximum sanctions, as they will be, if hundreds of billions of their assets are still frozen, as they will still be at war with frontline NATO states. I mean, remember, this is a country, Russia, that attempted to assassinate just last year the CEO of the largest German defense company. I mean, the Germans don't just take that sitting down. The Europeans are going to spend more money on defense. They are going to ensure that they are arming themselves to deal with those challenges, and the Russians will still be fighting them. So, I mean, it's inconceivable with a rogue state that is that aggrieved, that powerful, and that willing to continue a war against NATO, you wouldn't have that on the top half of your top risks piece, even if we get, as we believe we will, a ceasefire.
Okay.
Evan, can I jump in
Yeah,
here?
jump in, Cliff. Go ahead.
One thing real quick. We need to mention this increasingly dangerous Russia, Iran, North Korea partnership. It was born from Russian needs during the war, but it's become more right now. And the really hot issue here is, what is Kim Jong-un after for sending 11,000 troops that are now dying? North Koreans are dying. What's the ask? He wants a warhead that can re-enter the atmosphere and hit countries like the United States. So we're playing with really big toys here. Will the Russians do that? It's a very important question. Let me leave it at that.
Yeah, well, you leave it at that and leave us shuddering a bit, because that is absolutely why it's a top risk. And just keep in mind, when Ian talked about Europe, later in this live stream, we'll talk about the red herrings, and just put a little marker on there when we talk about Europe. And one of the red herrings, as Ian talked about, how they're rearming. But let's go now to top risk number, top risk number 4, as we really now get into the heart of it, Trumponomics. What will the economy look like in 14 days when Donald Trump, whose favorite word he likes to say is tariffs, he believes tariffs are the answer to all the ills of the economy, trade wars, are we facing higher inflation? Are we facing weaker global GDP? Let's bring in Jon Lieber, because he has been so patient, so unusually patient here in all this. Lieber, give us your sense on the read on Trumponomics.
Thanks, Evan. So Trumponomics is this really interesting mix of policies that the new administration's coming in with. Now, they're inheriting a pretty good economic outlook. Growth has been solid. Job gains have been substantial in the Biden administration, and inflation seems like it's mostly under control. Some questions around that next year, but for now, it is mostly under control. So Trump's coming in with this mix of deregulation, anti-immigration policy, higher tariffs, and potentially loose fiscal policy. And that's an unusual combination of things that kind of cuts in multiple different directions. Deregulation is going to be felt most strongly in financial services, in oil and gas. Loose fiscal policy means you get both stimulus, consumers have more money in their pockets, and taxes remain low, but there's a lot of issuance of treasury debt, which is a concern for the markets over the long term. And then there's the two big pieces of what Trump promised on the campaign trail, which is a smaller workforce because of deportations, but also higher tariffs. And on balance, these should be inflationary. We just don't know how far Trump's going to go with all of this. His deregulatory agenda could be the leading edge of the spear that ends up really unleashing a lot of productivity growth in the United States. And that's kind of what you see the markets pricing in right now. But on the other hand, particularly in industries that are extremely exposed to trade or to foreign workers, this could be bad news. And it could mean a slowdown. It could be harder to hire people in construction and agriculture, in domestic production. All of these things could suffer under these new barriers that are going to be erected. We don't know how far Trump's going to go on all of this, but if you take his campaign promises at their word, that's a pretty negative outlook for those industries.
Yeah, you've got the tax cuts and you've got deregulation, Susan, on one hand. Then you've got the promise of mass deportation, how big that will be, and the promise of mass tariffs, across the board. Susan, weigh in on that element of Trumponomics. Everyone's trying to figure out what these tariffs will actually be, how much of these are a negotiating tool so Trump gets what he wants early, and how much will actually be a reality.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. We're so quickly immersed in a very un-American game of parsing the psychology of one man, and that, I think, is a big shift in how we're used to thinking about American economic policy. And Trump has benefited in many ways politically, certainly here in the U.S., from the tendency to see a lot of what he says as sort of bluster, or maybe he means it, maybe he doesn't. There's room for interpretation. There's room for negotiation. That, of course, increases his relative power. It increases the need for companies to come to Washington to spend millions of dollars on lobbying, on trying to get in front of Donald Trump. There's a view. It is one that I largely agree with, that Trump is highly open to whatever is the suggestion of the person he spoke with most recently. However, and this is a very important caveat, he has very few fixed principles. A belief in the almost magical transformative power of tariffs is one of them. And I think that, I am tariff man, one of his most famous quotes from his Twitter feed back in the first Trump administration. It shouldn't have been a surprise to people when he finally sort of closed down the years-long internal feuding in the first couple years between his economic advisors over imposing those tariffs and went ahead with them. He obviously intends to do so now, even if the number is not a fixed number just yet. So I think that's, really important to keep in mind is that for a man of very few fixed beliefs, this is absolutely one of them. Just this morning, I saw that he was saying basically tariffs will be the magical solution to any economic problems that arise. The other thing is mass deportations now in all caps. Trump made very few, at least specific promises in the campaign that he just won. When it comes to traditional kind of policy discourse, it was mostly absent. This is one that was a highly specific promise from Trump. And not only that, but he believes it's core to why he won re-election to the White House in the first place, is this idea that his supporters are most motivated by his anti-immigration views and promises. Again, do we know the exact number that will constitute mass deportations now for Donald Trump? We don't really. Yet we do know and should expect that this is really going to happen in a way that perhaps many Americans and many American businesses have not fully appreciated the extent to which this is going to be a disruptive factor. And it's going to come very early on in the new Trump administration.
Yeah, Ian, I know you want to jump in there because, tariff man is the kryptonite inflation, as John talked about. And what about the it's not like, if you slap tariffs on everyone, they happen in a vacuum. Countries will retaliate and there's knock-on consequences. Ian.
Look, and I mean, it's not going to be as hard and as fast as his campaign promises. I mean, 60% across the board on China. No one really expects that. It's not going to be every country the U.S. has a trade deficit. There will be deals that are cut. And also there will be things that Trump can do that will make the markets much happier, that will help the economy. There is a deregulatory thrust, the financial sector, the crypto companies, the fossil fuel companies. I mean, many others will do well in that environment. And he's also going to extend the tax cuts for high income individuals and for corporations. But the low-hanging fruit was largely picked in the first term, and the macroeconomic conditions are worse, right? Debt levels are higher, interest rates are higher. The multiples that companies are trading at right now are much higher than they were before. So there's just not as much room for Trump's playbook that got him a lot of enthusiasm and market pump and growth the first time for him to get that again. And yet the stuff that John's talking about, Susan's talking about on the border and deportations and on tariffs, he fully intends to do, and he has a much more consolidated Republican Party and administration under him to get it done. So, it's just that the markets really don't seem to appreciate where the politics are heading in this coming year.
Okay, I want to link that because Trumponomics is top risk number 4 on the Eurasia Group top risk report. We've released it this morning. Remember, go to the Eurasia Group website and we'll give you all the information at the end. You can read this 42-page report. It's really well worth checking out. We're going through them on a very top line level, but the details of these really matter. Number 4 is Trumponomics. Linked to that, and now you're going to start seeing the bundling here, is top risk number 3. And Cliff, I'll bring you in on this one, the U.S.-China breakdown. We talk a lot about tariffs. China's a big target on that. The return to office may kind of usher in an accelerated decoupling of the U.S.-China relationship. And that, of course, could have major economic and geopolitical consequences. What is the top risk of the U.S.-China breakdown, which is occurring right after, I guess at the end of the last year and a half or 2 years of the Biden administration, they kind of patched things up a bit?
Right now, Biden has done a quite good job of stabilizing the relationship. There's a thick web of diplomacy beneath it. And that's going to end. It's going to change. Trump, there'll be four main drivers that we see, mostly on the US side, of a breakdown in the relationship. And we use that word, breakdown. It's a strong word. We've talked about the tariffs. We don't know exactly what they are, but if he's in the range of a 60% top rate, in the range of an average applied tariff of 25%, that's just too much, too much to swallow for China. Secondly, U.S. tech policy, export controls. We'll see tougher licensing requirements. We'll see more controls coming out of the Trump administration. We'll see what the Chinese perceive as efforts to delegitimize the Chinese Communist Party. When Trump, 2 weeks before he left office last time, he banned visas for members of the party. If they start to do that again, and Hill's already talking about it, the Chinese, will just grimace. Finally, Taiwan. Not the main problem right now, because the Chinese are satisfied with their ability to kind of coerce William Lai, at least for now, but it will be an irritant. So China, this kind of assembly of reasons, U.S. policies will react, some form of a trade war. They will react with, their export control regime on critical minerals, more export controls of their own. We'll have a back and forth. Unmanaged decoupling will disrupt global supply chains, increase costs, and it will kind of petrify, ossify mutual suspicion. So it's a really bad story.
Susan, let me bring you in on that. Look, U.S.-China relations are the dominant axis here. What's your sense of the risk, as Cliff outlined some of the key kind of pressure points here?
Yeah, look, the new Trump administration hasn't even taken office yet, but I think one thing that stands out from a number of his appointees, it hasn't gotten as much attention, understandably, as the kind of personal scandals and extreme views of many of the appointees. But several of his national security appointees, including the people in key positions like Mike Waltz, the incoming national security advisor, Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida who's slated to be Secretary of State, they are really China hawks. And in many ways, I think you're going to see, to a certain extent, the kind of push-pull that happened in the first Trump administration over Russia, where you had kind of Russia hawks in a lot of these national security jobs, but Trump himself obviously taking in a very different view, a much more accommodationist view toward Putin and toward Russia. I think that's going to be kind of what you see on China policy in a second term, where you have these kind of China hawks. You're going to hear a lot from the more establishment, old-fashioned conservative types who remain in the Republican Party saying, look, we're really tough on China. But then you have Trump's own impulses and instincts. He's going to want to keep American business tycoons happy. He's got Elon Musk whispering in his ear at all times, the house guest who won't go away. We'll see if he actually moves from Mar-a-Lago into the White House with Trump. But, even if he doesn't, that's going to be a major fault line. And so, it'll be interesting to me to see the extent to which the kind of China hawks are able to impose those views in a broader way in the Trump 2.0 administration or not.
I'm just smiling because of that shot we just showed of Elon Musk poking his head between Vance and Trumpian. And by the way, Susan, I think you probably get the point from raising the Elon Musk name first here, because it's not insignificant, Ian, specifically around China, where he's got his own interests. But Ian, just weigh in on the China-Trump, the China-US situation and how it may become a greater risk in 2025.
Trump is by inclination a deal maker with anyone. He doesn't care what your values are, what kind of political system he has. It's just like real estate. If you're going to spend more money on his property, he's going to sell it to you, right? So, it's consistent. He's been that way for a long time. And sometimes it works out for him. Remember Kim Jong-un, he had a couple of summits and people said, oh, we didn't get anything done. Actually, there was a freeze for freeze. The North Koreans froze their missile tests and the Americans froze their military exercises with the South Koreans. And actually the relationship deteriorated under Biden. So it's not like Trump can't do a deal with China. He can't. But as Cliff and Susan mentioned, we have a lot of things. It's a very complicated relationship and a lot of things that are mitigating against it. First is that there are so many people in the Republican Party, including in Trump's old administration, that are far more hawkish on China. And when I say far more hawkish, I don't just mean like want to change the status quo on Taiwan. I mean, they want the Americans to engage in regime change in China. That's not something that exists in the Biden administration. There are a lot of people that advise Trump that really believe that these two countries can't actually coexist, that America's policy should be to contain and defeat the Chinese Communist Party. That's number one. Number two, the Republicans in the House and Senate are pushing towards more restrictions on China, more export controls, more companies that you can't do work with, a broader definition of national security in how the Americans shouldn't be engaging with China, tougher technology controls on semiconductors. So look, it is absolutely plausible that Trump will get on the phone with Xi Jinping, and maybe Elon will be on the phone too, as he has been with like Zelensky, for example, and other leaders, Erdogan. And Trump will, as he said before, Xi Jinping, he's very smart. He's a strong leader. I respect him a lot. Maybe they'll talk for a couple of hours and they'll talk about a deal. But I don't think that you can get from there to the Chinese giving enough to break through on what Trump wants. And I also don't think that Elon Musk is willing to use his personal capital on that issue. I think he's much more willing to do things that he'll win with, like go after political opponents in the UK and Germany and Canada and at home in the United States, that he's fully aligned with Trump on. I think it would be a challenging one for Elon to go full on publicly and say, I'm going to stabilize, I'm going to be Kissinger, I'm going to stabilize this relationship. It is possible. I mean, recognize that there is a 10% chance that Trump actually gets a huge deal done with the Chinese that no one else could have done, because he's the one that's willing to put huge pressure on China at a time that China is particularly weak. It's possible. But we are saying in this report that we fundamentally don't expect that's going to happen, and that rather we think the most important geopolitical relationship in the world is set to become significantly worse in this year.
Okay, we have 15 minutes left. We got the red herrings as well, but we are now down to the top risks of 2025. Number two is again very much connected to the conversation that we've just been having about US and China. And let's reveal it now. The number two top risk of 2025 is the rule of dawn, a shift from the rule of law, as the founding fathers envisioned, to the rule of a man. And it has consequential implications for US governance. Susan talked about that earlier, saying, you know, we're here kind of doing a Kremlinology about what Trump's saying on True Social. Let me bring in Jon Lieber, rule of dawn. What is it? Why does it matter? What's the risk? Jon.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary, Evan, and Susan alluded to this earlier as well. It's the fact that you've got a lot of power concentrated in one person in the US now. He's got a lot of control over the Republican Party in Congress. That's not unusual for a president, but the Republicans have had trouble corralling themselves and rowing in the same direction over the last several years. And as we saw last week with the vote around Speaker Mike Johnson, Trump is clearly calling the shots right now. And so that gives him a lot of latitude to get his agenda through. It means there won't be much pushback against him in Congress. We've seen this over the years, the fact that he was able to avoid 2 impeachments in his first term. And, you know, there's a lot of unpredictability about what exactly he's going to do. So just this morning, we saw the Washington Post reported with a couple of sources from inside the Trump transition process saying that they were going to scale back some of the tariffs that Trump has been planning, across the board tariffs. And then Trump came over the top and said in a Truth Social post that that's absolutely not going to happen. So this is a challenging environment for business leaders to try to navigate. Trump's very transactional. He's very interpersonal. He believes in making connections with people, whether that's foreign leaders or business leaders in the US. And this means that that's a factor that a lot of companies are going to have to think about when approaching the United States over the next 4 years, is what kind of relationship do you have personally with Donald Trump, with members of his inner circle, with his family? Can you leverage those relationships to try to gain more power and influence? And can you use those relationships to try to steer policy in a way that helps your business and hurts others? Now, this, of course, a lot of this is not brand new. A lot of this happened in the Biden administration under previous presidents. We've seen norms eroding in the US for a while. I mean, two recent examples would be Biden pardoning his son, and then Biden using the CFIUS process to block the acquisition of US steel by Nippon Steel because of his own political interests. But we think all of that gets supercharged in the upcoming Trump administration, making the environment more difficult for businesses to navigate.
Okay, you use the word norms erode, and we talked a lot about that. Trump #1, Susan, Trump 1.0, a lot of guardrails. Trump 2.0, way more experience, way fewer guardrails. What kind of norms are you looking in terms of internal governance eroding as it becomes the rule of done?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that, of course, people are right when they say, Trump 2.0, he's made a real focus on loyalty, on making sure that he didn't bring in people to his White House and to his administration who would be there to actively oppose his agenda. That really was the case, remarkably, in some of the key positions throughout the Trump first term. And that's something that, we chronicled in our book, The Divider. We debriefed about 300 people who served in that Trump administration, almost all of them Republicans appointed by Trump himself or nonpartisan, career officials of some type. Remarkably consistent accounts. And it's important to note that because Donald Trump is a 78-year-old man. 78-year-old men do not change. And they just become more like themselves. So let's stipulate that Donald Trump is still going to be Donald Trump. What does that mean? It means he encourages conflict, infighting, a state of uncertainty and dysfunction. That is endemic to who Donald Trump is, and in any institution and any organization he's ever been associated with. So you can reliably expect that there will be that notwithstanding, the sort of somewhat more positive initial surround sound of having a chief of staff who's looking not to confront him, but to enable and to facilitate his policy goals. But I think more importantly, when it comes to this question of how much change can Trump wreak or, damage, depending on your perspective, I would make a distinction between the what I expect to be the endemic ideological and political infighting that will still occur in the Trumpified Republican Party. There are fault lines in this party. There are ideological disagreements, between the evangelical voters who were core to Trump getting elected both times and who want to pursue national abortion restrictions, and those who are more pragmatic politicos a la Trump himself, who won't want to touch those divisive social issues. But put aside the ideological and the policy fights that will definitely occur. And I think the biggest risk factor that I would underscore, and maybe even more so than your very good Eurasia report does today, that would be on the side of risk to the institutions of our government, to democracy. The name Kash Patel hasn't been mentioned here. What Trump proposes to do with the FBI, the Justice Department, the American intelligence community, those are things where I see much more unity, much more willingness on the part of Republicans to give him a free hand, and much greater potential for really long-term damage that survives the Trump presidency itself.
Okay, we're gonna get back into that in a minute, but I want to get to the #1, and this will play out. The #1 top risk of the year, in some senses, aggregates a lot of what we've been talking about in the first 9, including the rule of done. And let's reveal it now. The Eurasia Group top risk of 2025 is the GZERO wins. That means, as Cliff spoke about earlier, the new and expanding power vacuums, the emboldened rogue actors or strongman leaders, the heightened risk for dangerous accidents, conflicts, or miscalculations, and the geopolitical risk grows, and maybe the guardrails are thinner. Ian, you coined the term, the GZERO world. What do you mean by the GZERO wins, and why is it the top risk of this year?
That's the principal disorder that helps you understand the world today. I mean, Trump is not the top risk. Trump is the leading symptom, and in many ways, the most powerful beneficiary of the GZERO. And so too, all of the anti-establishment wave that we've seen, anti-incumbency trends across the world in so many democracies last year and this year playing out. It is an absence of global leadership. There's a lot of leadership in the world. It's not global. There's no, communities together working to respond to global challenges. It's funny, for the last 30 years, the US has been, as an exceptionalist power that believed that it had values that other countries needed to look up to, it was trying to get China to align more with the United States. It said, look, you guys are not responsible stakeholders. We are the internationalists. We are US-led multilateralists. We want you to support those institutions too, support rule of law, support global stability, support free trade. We bring them into the WTO. Turns out China's unwilling to do all of that. It's led to a lot of conflict. What's interesting, the reason the GZERO wins in 2025 is because the United States has rejected that model, as Cliff said earlier, and is embracing a more Chinese worldview, a transactional worldview, a worldview that is indifferent to rule of law, that is focused on the law of the jungle, that America gets what it wants because it's the most powerful. Elon gets what he wants because he has the most money and is the closest to the US president. That's the way it runs. And if you want to win in that world, you better do what the Americans say. It's an American first model. So the GZERO world and a consolidated America first are the same thing, but just from different perspectives. GZERO is what happens with everybody else, and America first is what happens with the Americans. And China first works pretty well as long as they're not dealing with the US. If they're dealing with smaller countries, it's all China first, right? I mean, Canada first, if there were countries smaller than Canada, would be a workable model, Evan. But the point is that we, I think the most important factor to look at for 2025 is not any one of these developments, but rather the fact that we no longer have an international model to respond to global opportunities and challenges. That has broken down. And so that's what we mean when we say the GZERO wins.
Cliff, just picking up on that, because in the top risk, you talk about this being as dangerous a crisis as the 1930s, which is pretty shocking. But if you're a middle power, Ian mentioned Canada, but any of them these countries who rely on these institutions from the Second World War that were stabilizing and could mitigate against global issues, those are weakening those structures. And in it, as you say, the GZERO wins. Pick up on that, Cliff.
We have structural weakening of the post-World War II international order. That's the UN, it's the World Bank, it's the IMF, it's the WTO, which is already completely broken. The other way, of thinking about it is what Ian was getting to. It's kind of everybody first. It's not just America first. And when you get everybody first, you have a very, very, very chaotic world. And I think what's the point on it to me this year is that Trump is so much America first that it puts the dangers of an everybody first world way out in front.
We've got about 4 minutes. I want to get to red herrings, but real quick on that one, Susan, any quick point on the GZERO wins? In other words, America first, and everyone has to follow that model. And you got this this kind of global breakdown?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that framework for looking at what's happening here. The instability that comes with that is one where the political weaknesses inside the West become their own kind of international story. And I think that's the big thing, that anti-incumbency doesn't stay at home, that internal dysfunction on Capitol Hill is not something that is purely a matter for the US this time around. And people have consistently cut Trump kind of the benefit of the doubt. I think that his reputation for intemperance or unpredictability actually helped him in his first term. I don't know whether it will help him avoid a major crisis internationally in his second term. And that, to me, is a big question that comes from where we are now. That was very different than 8 years ago.
That leads us to our red herring. So we've gone through all top 10 top risks. We got about 3.5, 4 minutes left. And I'll start with Jon, but Susan's point, top risk, the GZERO wins, top risk number 2, the rule of dawn. But one of our red herrings was Trump fails. Another one was, by the way, Europe breaks apart. Red herrings, just so folks understand that. These are things that people think are going to happen, but they probably won't. Jon, people think, oh, it's going to fail. Trump 2.0 is all bluster, no action. Why is that a red herring?
Yeah, I think this is an administration that's set up to succeed, at least for the first 12 months. Certainly with the unified government, there's a lot they can do in terms of legislation. And on the world stage, Trump's got plans that, we think will come to pass. We think there will be a ceasefire in Ukraine. We think that he's probably going to rack up at least a couple of apparent wins in the Middle East as those conflicts die down. And we think that the relationship between the U.S. and China is on a worsening trajectory, but doesn't lead to a full breakdown that undermines the global economic growth. So this is 2025 is set up to be a decent year for Trump, and it's not like he's coming in with a lot more acceptance, kind of who he is and what his administration means and what they're going to do, and also what the American people want. And that kind of legitimacy that he comes into office with is going to help him succeed in this year.
Ian, just pick up on that, but also one of the other red herrings, and if we can just put it up, is Europe breaks apart, Europe breaks, which some have argued that Trump might be an instrument of, but why is that a red herring?
Yeah, well, I mean, picking up on what Jon just had to say, the fact is that the U.S. is in a much stronger position now, both vis-a-vis its adversaries, because China's economy is doing so badly, Russia's in serious decline, Iran is falling apart, and vis-a-vis its friends. Look at where the South Korea government isn't right now, or Japan, or Germany, or France, or Canada. So, I mean, the U.S. just has a lot more leverage to get stuff done if Trump is making major demands. His government is more consolidated, despite the chaos that we will surely see, as Susan noted. And the environment is much more dangerous. In other words, you get crossways with the United States and with Trump at your peril compared to 2017. So I do expect that there are going to be more wins for Trump in the first year. He's going to rack up the score. That doesn't mean that there won't be a couple of major crises out there, because the world is far more dangerous. He has to get it right all the time to not have major crises. I don't know how lucky you feel, right? But in Europe, there has been a presumption that Trump is going to make Europe fall apart. Trump does not like unified Europe. He doesn't like the EU. He likes Brexit. When he used to meet with Macron, he used to always say, when are you going to do what the UK did? When are you going to do a Frexit, right? No, that's not going to happen. Actually, the Europeans are much more consolidated. The new German government coming in is going to be much stronger and aligned with Macron than Scholz has been. The new EU leadership with von der Leyen, with people like Metsola, with Kaja Kallas, these are actually very strong unified leaders, just as the former Dutch PM, Mark Rutte, who has now taken over NATO. And they know that Russia is a very serious crisis for them, for European security. In fact, they're now working on 3% of GDP spend on defense, which they're going to do outside the EU so that the Hungarians can't veto it. So I think over the course of this year, yes, you'll see more populism. You'll see more governments like you're seeing in Austria right now that'll orient towards a Trumpist sort of policy. But actually, Europe will hold together, and wouldn't surprise me if they're even stronger on balance because of the crises at the end of 2025 than we saw coming into it. That is not expected today.
Okay, we've come to the end of this, but boy, there are so much to talk about. As Ian writes in this, and Cliff, there's a lot of risks, but we're still kind of optimistic, and there's a lot of opportunities out there. But those red herrings that, just to go over, Trump fails, probably, not going to happen. Europe breaks apart. We talk also about energy transition. And then those top risks, the Mexican standoff, ungoverned spaces, AI unbound, beggar thy world, Iran on the ropes, Russia still rogue, Trumponomics, US-China breakdown, and finally, and rule of law, and then, of course, GZERO wins. That does it. It's a remarkable document. I really thank Cliff and Ian and the team that worked on that. It's really worth reading. Download the report at the Eurasia Group website. You can see it up on the site there. Jon and Susan Glasser, Jon Lieber, phenomenal to have you there. And today to help us put all of this into perspective. And remember, I hope you can read all this. Catch not just the top risk reports, but watch Ian on the GZERO World program, GZERO World with Ian Bremmer. It's on PBS across the US and Canada. By the way, in the report, there's notes on Canada with news today, big news there, Brazil, Japan, lots of other countries. So if you have specific interests, there's top risk in that, or there's more information in the top risk report. And for daily coverage of all the global issues and the perspectives you need, please take a moment to subscribe to our free newsletters, GZERO Daily. Ian writes one on Wednesday. We've got one on Canada. We've got one on AI. And every day you can follow the URL on the screen. I think it's below me here. And so check it all out. Ian, Cliff, Jon, Susan, and the entire team, Tony and his crew who put these live streams together. Thank you. But mostly thank all of you for watching. We will keep track of these top risks throughout the year. You can hold us accountable to them, and they are a framework through which you can help navigate what will be a really difficult world. And for those of you who don't have a cuddly dog like Moose, good luck, and we'll see you all very soon. Thanks for watching.
Clear?
Mike's, all the mics. Or you don't say anything. Clear?